Hey, welcome back to the Cycle World Podcast. Kevin Cameron's with me. I'm Mark Hoyer. Our topic this week is Kevin called it how much better it could all be. I say, what's making the modern motorcycle so slow? Now it's fast, but also there is so much potential out there. What could we change to have 300 mile an hour motorcycles? You name it. So Kevin and I, mostly Kevin went off and did some maths. I like to call it maths like the British because it makes it sound like there's more of it.
Yeah.
And there is a lot. And so maths is kind of a overwhelming but awesome way to describe it. So Kevin went off and did the maths and worked up a few things, and we'll let him release the clutch on the podcast.
Okay.
Get us moving.
One of the obvious things that holds motorcycles back is that they are, in the language of the wind tunnel, aerodynamically dirty.
Oh, they're horrible. I always go back Caltech with the midget, they called it, the Harley XRTT, and they were doing wind tunnel testing in Caltech, and they put a motorcycle in there and they blew the air over it and they got their numbers, and then they put a flat piece of plywood with the same frontal area
in the tunnel.
it in the tunnel, just the plywood, and it had better aerodynamics than a motorcycle.
Yes. It's crazy.
It's so tragic.
Yep. Well, here we have these MotoGP bikes, which are very powerful. People have started to go off the deep end now. The last claim I saw was 340 horsepower, and before that it was 300. And to me, 275 looks pretty impressive, because back in the days of the early 752 strokes, which was where I stepped on the moving belt, somewhere between 90 and 120 horsepower was the revolution of 1972. So 275 horsepower is a bunch. And yet the top speeds that have been seen are up to about 225 miles an hour.
Oh, is that all?
And so I worked through it to see what a ballpark figure for frontal area multiplied times aerodynamic coefficient, drag coefficient, C sub D. We all know what frontal area is. If you put your motorcycle in front of a white screen and had a pinpoint source of light miles and miles away, and you drew the outline of the motorcycle shadow and measured that area, that is frontal area. I did that in the long basement once with my 750. Anyway, frontal area multiplied times a figure of merit that tells us how much better the streamlining of the object we're interested in is than a piston of the same frontal area as the motorcycle, which pushes all the air ahead of it and doesn't let any flow around it. It just pushes it forward. In other words, all the air that it encounters is accelerated to the speed of the vehicle. So by rounding the edges, I think Volkswagen found that rounding the edges on their little Volkswagen van raised the top speed quite substantially from, 48 miles an hour or something. And then you see these people used to see these people cutting the gutters off their cars because it just makes them take off, man. Rounding the corners is a great thing. But here are some sample drag coefficients, C sub D. A really good car might be somewhere in the 0.3s. A Zeppelin of the World War I era, 0.05. A fighter plane, a piston engine fighter plane of World War II, 0.14. And a motorcycle 0.6. So it's right there with a bread truck, a big rectangular parallelepiped being shoved through the air by its engine. Now, what is streamlining? The aim of streamlining is not to share the vehicle's energy with anything else. So we want to push aside the air molecules, nitrogen and oxygen chiefly, that are in our way. Just push them to the side. Don't get them tumbling or whirling or forming vortices. And then as we pass, to let them gradually close behind us and resume their original positions, velocities, and directions. Now, clearly impossible. But a modern airplanes get some pretty good C sub Ds, and they're able to go a tremendous distance. Their glide ratios are up around 17 or more. So if you're a mile high, you would intersect Mother Earth 17 miles farther along. But now look at the rules from 1958. They said no more dustbin fairings. They have bad gust response. They are crazy, veering, yaw prone, threats to navigation. So we'll have no more of that. Because it used to be that they would build these beautiful Craig Vetter-like enclosures for the motorcycle and the rider in the tucked-in position.
Well, and way out in front of the front wheel. I mean, they were just really. I mean, they were long.
They had long tails.
And,
they had a long tail section. Usually, the tail was removed. They go out and practice. You want the tail off? Yeah, I think so. But they were highly efficient, which is how 125s making 20 horsepower were able to get up to 125 miles an hour. So I thought to myself, I'll just do some calculations here and see what would happen if we could cut frontal area times C sub D in half. And I found that if our top speed is 220 originally, the new top speed would be 277 miles per hour. Now, that may be a little disappointing because we've cut the CDA in half, but the terrible fact is that aerodynamic drag, the force of drag, increases as the square of velocity. And if we want the horsepower that is required to overcome that drag, we need another velocity term because horsepower is force times velocity. So then it becomes drag is proportional to horsepower is proportional to speed cubed. So if we want to go twice as fast, it's going to take 2 times 2 times 2, or 8 times more horsepower than we presently have, which is a tall order.
Pretty tall order. I wanted to really quick, you were talking about the guys taking the tail section off for aero.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Joe Petrali in the 30s, I think it was, had a land speed knucklehead, and they took it out, and he was, going for a record, and he did set a record. It was in the 130s or something, but he set the record without the back of the bike on it because it was just like a little cap over the handlebars, and then these like fared in girder forks.
Yeah,
and then the tail section was really long, and it instability putting that stuff behind him really. So they actually took the stuff off for him to set the record.
Well, there was
something about center of pressure, right? You're moving the center of pressure, and if it's not in the right spot, bad things happen.
Not only that, but if you increase the sort of mass times lever arm of the rear caster, you can invite into your home, so to speak, the dreaded high-speed weave. And we don't talk about that. We're good industry guys, and we never mention weave. So if anyone asks you, you tell them. It's not a good. Well, this is why Europeans load a tank bag. It's weight forward, rather than having a one of those hanging planters sticking up behind the passenger with all the bedrolls and tents and Coleman stoves and so forth strapped to it.
Yeah,
Load
you gotta
forward.
You got to work really hard if you're going to have all that stuff on the back of the bike. Very common to get a decel shimmy if you just take random street bike and say, "Oh, we're going to put a top trunk on it." You put the trunk on it, decel shimmy. I test for that somewhat riskily, I suppose, but you just roll off and then you take your hands off because you have a natural tendency to damp the movement. And at low, let's say, low magnitude, it's fine if you just get a little bit. You take it off and it goes, and you're like, okay, none of that.
Yeah.
You don't want it to get away from you.
I will do up the snaps on my glove before departing rather than as I ride.
I always loved that Bates fairing that they made, this great big Bates fairing that had a trunk behind the headlight, and in front of the windscreen they had a big front trunk. And I'm like, well, don't put your bowling balls up there. I think the best place for weight is down low and forward of the rider, in fact. So if you could put your saddlebags somewhere up there around the mast of the engine, you'd probably be best off.
Yes. So what's wrong with motorcycles that they have such high drag coefficients? Well, the first thing is they don't look like a salmon or a trout, because a salmon or a trout looks like it's designed to push the water aside and then put it back together again.
Go nature. I think it was Dennis Manning. Dennis Manning said that exact thing. He's like, when I went out, because Dennis Manning's a longtime land speeder, and he said, well, when I started doing this, there were all kinds of different aero things going on, but I thought, well, nature's been at this kind of a long time. And so we copied, we started looking at salmon. Salmon swim upstream, and it's a lot of work. So we want to get the most out of it.
Got it. The thing with the motorcycle is that it makes no attempt to close its wake. Now, who cares about closing the wake? Look at the front of the thing. It's nice and round and it's smooth. No, it's not, because the wheel is sticking out there. So I'm reading through a bunch of stuff in aero books, and it comes up with this gem. One of those 1950s B-47 jet bombers, 4 engines, is descending to land. And at the highest speed for which it is qualified to lower the gear, they lower the landing gear and the drag doubles. They've just stuck a couple of wheels out of the fuselage and one's out at the wingtips or somewhere. They haven't disturbed the whole thing to a tremendous extent, but the drag is doubled by sticking those turbulence-generating undercarriage legs out into the air. So a motorcycle has this disturbance-creating front wheel in the front. Oh, well, it's got a smooth fender on it. Come on. No. And, of course, the motorcycle does not have a long tail that puts the air back where it was comfortable before we arrived. And the way the tapered tail works to improve the coefficient of drag is as if the air is a big slippery hand grasping a tapered bar of soap. You give it a squeeze and patooey, it produces thrust.
Well, Rich Oliver, famous 250 racer with so many championships, 250 AMA, 252 stroke, 250 Grand Prix. He talked about at Daytona, moving out of the saddle and arching his back until he felt a certain pressure. and for sure his leather stopped flapping, because if you see the guys go and he would pick up RPM just by getting off the saddle. Now that, that's great to talk about, but when you're getting mashed into a motorcycle and you have the ability to stand off the pegs to or wherever it's happening, I think that's pretty darn impressive.
Well, you still see people doing it in MotoGP.
Yeah.
Just raising their back up until the air coming off the screen can attach to the rider's back.
Yeah.
Rather than separating into a sheet of energy eating vortices.
Yeah. The other thing that came to me while you were talking about instability, we were talking about weave or shimmy and centers of pressure. I think it was an Eric Bostrom story. And you had observed Eric at Daytona on the banking, and the bike would start to weave, and he would get out of the saddle. He would take his ass off the saddle, lighten up, put more pressure on the pegs, and hang onto the bars. And he became the damper for that system rather than being the weight on it that was starting to feed back in it. Yep. Yeah. And he got off the saddle and stabilized the bike.
That was his comeback ride after his time at Honda. He rode the Kawasaki at Daytona, and he said, I couldn't have stopped it doing that pumping. That's rider talk at that time for the weave oscillation, which is the rear of the bike, 2 or 3 cycles per second. And he said, then I found that if I kind of took my weight off the seat, it would settle down. So he said, I rode the whole 200 miles that way, standing up. And these people are in shape.
Yeah.
They're not just young guys who have quick wrists and a taste for risk. They are doing everything they can to improve their performance.
Oh, there was a physio many years ago when Biaggi and Rossi were still, heated rivals in Grand Prix, and he was instrumenting riders while they were racing. And Rossi would run, something fairly astronomical during a race, like 180 heart rate, which is quite a lot. If I hit 140 at the gym, I'm like, feeling it. And but I'm not. I'll say I'm not in the best shape of my life, but Biaggi would run 200, 220, like he would, and you could see that in their personalities, right? Like Rossi's kind of mentally the more cruisy guy, and Biaggi was like, really, he seemed strung pretty tight. But the guys today, they train like pro cyclists. They're ripping heart rates, and they're doing the same thing. Most of those guys, I think, are 180, 175, and in that range. And they're all just lean as could be, just.
And of course, the people back in the pits are looking at your lap times the whole time. And if they see that you're wheezing out, you're going to hear about it.
Yeah.
When Lawson went over for the first time, Kenny told him at the end of the year, you let down the side. You're just not in good enough shape. And Lawson trained like a maniac, and he got into that 180 heart rate club, and just became a beast.
Oh, Matt Mladen was the same, man. He always had Matt Mladen would always say that he wasn't the most talented rider in the paddock, but he could outwork anyone. And there was this lore at the time where he would allow himself 1 latte per week. Like he wouldn't, just really. And then, to have somebody like Anthony Gobert coming along, who's just like mac and cheeseburgers and just drinking his brains out, and to come and barely be able to zip his leathers up and go out and do a few laps at the very end of qualifying because he showed up late. They're like, where's Anthony? This is Terry Vance, who's Terry really is a very supportive top guy, right? Like he really wants people to succeed. And you got Gobert, he doesn't know where Gobert is. And then Anthony shows up like minutes before the end of qualifying, gets on the bike, goes out, does some laps, comes back, is heaving and sweating and lays down. He's like, how do we do? He's like, oh, lap record. Okay, great.
Yeah, because this man must have had some group of mutations that were let's do it to this guy.
Yeah.
And it didn't mean anything to him. But anyway, we're getting far off the topic here.
I love getting off topic, Kevin. Come on.
Well, yes, but we promised them something. We've got to give
Yes,
them
let's
something.
get back to it. What's wrong with the damn modern motorcycle? Why is it so slow?
Well, they're so slow. So I thought, okay, let's do the calculation for really cleaning this thing up to sort of propeller-driven airplane standard. Same horsepower, same frontal area, 349 miles per hour.
Yeah, now we're talking.
Now we're talking. So we're just glad that we don't do that, because the faster you are going at the end of the straightaway, the sooner you have to brake. And these motorcycles, this powerful a motorcycle with this much drag, is making the front wheel light to the point that this whole winglet revolution was about keeping the front end down without having to, the system, the anti-wheelie system, roll the throttle off a little bit. So we're not going, it's not a realistic expectation that we would reach 349 miles per hour anywhere, but that's what the horsepower that I subtracted some for rolling resistance and some for winglets and so on. So I ended up with 245 horsepower. So there's potential out there. But again, the motorcycle, like ourselves, is a mass of compromises. We'd love to put the streamlined tail on there, but there are problems with it, which would have to be solved. And so people aren't kicking too much over these 1958 regulations, which say no streamlining behind the rider and no streamlining forward of a plane, a vertical plane 50 millimeters ahead of the front axle, I think. It was 100, then they took some back. Not sure why. But this is one of the things about going racing, is you get the rule book and you look at it and you think, wow, why did they do that? Why did they do this? Often someone's name is on some of these rules. Nixon wondered how he was going to run his tack wire from the engine to the tachometer. The tachometer's up in front of it, the tack wire goes out of it straight at the number plate. So he drilled a hole in the number plate, ran the tack wire through it. Oh, you're disqualified. You can't race with that. So, what are you going to, you just need a sense of humor. Officialdom, nod and smile, and resolve to get away with as much as you possibly can. Sure. Oh, that's racing clearance. We're not 2 millimeters over.
Interpretation. Yeah.
Then, of course, the internal combustion engine is a terrible scandal, which is that roughly 25%, kind of like the human body, roughly 25% of the fuel taken in actually produces mechanical work. Okay.
Oh, boy, there's room for improvement.
Yeah, plenty of room for improvement. The MotoGP bike, because it has high compression and a lot of measures have been taken to eliminate sources of friction and loss, runs a bit higher than that 25, I'm sure. But step up to diesel. There are diesel automobiles that you can buy, should you have the money, that, spark ignition gasoline burner uses roughly half a pound of fuel per horsepower developed for 1 hour. This is called the brake specific fuel consumption, or SFC, 0.5, corresponding to 25% efficiency. If we step to diesel, we get an automobile with 0.42. If we step back in time to the 1950s, there was the Wright turbo compound engine on late model Constellations and the Douglas DC-7, 0.38, because it had 3 little turbines driven by the exhaust, and they weren't turbochargers. They were geared back to the crankshaft. So they were using waste energy in the exhaust to help drive the propeller.
Amazing.
And 0.38, that's good. But first of all, the FIM aren't going to let us put power recovery turbines on our engine. And second of all, where would we put them and all the hot plumbing that they involve? There's all sorts of things we could do.
You're smashing my dreams, Kevin. Come on, don't be practical.
Be practical. The most efficient diesels are the ones that drive international trade. They're engines that have like 4-foot bore and 6-foot stroke, and their efficiency is like 0.5. 0.53 is the efficiency, and they use 1/4 of a pound of fuel per horsepower per hour. And then stepping beyond that, the eco people don't like anything that burns something. So they don't like combined cycle gas turbine electricity generating plants, even though they are now 60% efficient. And the great thing about natural gas, which they generally burn, is that each molecule of methane, which makes up most of natural gas, is 1 atom of carbon joined to 4 hydrogen atoms. So it has the least carbon per unit of heat output of any practical fuel. Well, we won't be satisfied with anything less than perfection. Okay, what else could we do? There's all this heat is pouring out of this power plant, so much so that people that are following in our draft are cooking their front tires. And I was tipped off to this by seeing the guys lining up at Motegi to do their end of practice clutch starts. And they're sitting there with the engine running. It was a still day. And you could see this column of distortion rising from each bike, all that heat. And of course, they're sitting there idling.
Good time for the toaster analogy, I think.
Yeah. Every horsepower is 746 watts, which incidentally is the power of a kitchen toaster. So when we look at where the energy goes in a spark-ignited piston engine, we've got 25 or 30% that produces mechanical power. We've got 1/3 that goes to the cooling system, because if we don't cool the piston crown, the inside of the combustion chamber, the cylinder walls, the oil will boil away. The material will rise to a temperature at which it fails. So all these parts are cooled. That becomes waste heat. It is heat that is not beating on piston crowns and pulling chain in at a tremendous rate and driving the rear wheel. Pardon me, shaft drive folks. Anyway, this heat loss is partly, the oil cooler is there as well. Mark was talking about what happens when we spray all this cooling oil up at the underside of the piston. We're doing this because we've made the piston so light that it can't get rid of its own heat by conduction. It's too thin.
Conduction to the cylinder walls.
To the cylinder walls.
Is the normal biggest path out of the
yes.
The piston.
It is not cooled to any significant extent by crankcase air, because that air is pretty hot itself. And what determines which way heat flows is the difference in temperature between the hot thing and the cold thing, called delta T. And there isn't much in the crankcase.
Ideally, all of the heat would be used from combustion would be used to push the piston down. It wouldn't be rejected into the engine around. That's not practical. We have lots of coatings now. The guys, I talked to a race engine builder who's building Cosworths, like old Cosworths and other things, and it's like he's putting slippery stuff on the piston skirts, and he's got heat rejecting coatings on the tops of the pistons, and he's doing the combustion chambers with these high zoot, aerospacey kind of coatings, and it's all in an effort to keep the heat in the chamber so that it pushes down. Well, we can't let the exhaust gas completely cool either, right? It's not,
because imagine the piston makes its stroke. At some point, maybe 50 degrees before bottom center, the exhaust valves begin to lift. So the pressure in the cylinder drops rapidly. Well, let's look at the PV diagram, pressure versus volume. Oh, it says here that we've got most of 100 psi at the moment of exhaust valve lifting. Well, that's valuable energy. Okay, let's make the stroke twice as long and expand it twice as far. Now we'll have to cut down peak revs because piston peak acceleration is directly proportional to stroke length. Double the stroke, double the stress. We've already got 11,000 Gs at top dead center at 18,000 RPM. 22,000 Gs? I don't think so. Not this week.
And it's how a turbo helps. It's how a turbo, or what Kevin was talking about with the aircraft engine that's putting energy back into the crank. It's using that heat and pressure energy to spin something that puts
push more air into the engine.
Pushes
because
some energy
power
back.
Is not only proportional to piston displacement, but also to how much mixture you can cram into it. And if you use a pump, a turbocharger, a supercharger, it's proportional to the volume of mixture that you can burn. Well, the U.S. Army decided this is too much. They adopted a thing called the single-fueled battlefield years and years ago. Drones, jeeps, tanks, airplanes all have to run on the same fuel, so that if you're out of fuel, the chances you can find a drum of fuel are pretty good. That fuel will burn in your
just
in
think
your
of
vehicle.
the inventory problems of having, it's like
World War II. They had red gas, they had purple gas, they had blue gas or some other color. Red gas was for jeeps. That was the stuff you can hear it knocking in the can. So all this stuff had to be kept separate. And of course, diesel for such tanks as had diesel engines. Strangely, although the Germans were the early hotbed of diesel development, in World War II, their tanks burned gasoline. And it was the Soviets whose tanks were diesel. Figure that out. Anyway, there have been experiments made with long-distance trucking in Europe with recovering exhaust heat and using it to raise steam and running that steam through a turbine, which helps to drive the truck. Well, that's okay for a system that's going to run for long periods at a constant power level. For example, combined cycle gas turbine electricity generating plants. A gas turbine puts out a huge hot breath. Anyone that's been around jet engines or helicopters knows that hot roast fuel smell is hot air from the engine. They run that through a heat exchanger. They raise steam. They drive a steam turbine with it, and it sits there generating all this power, 60% efficiency, which is outstanding. Well, they haven't adopted it for trucks widely. What are the chances of deciding that we could recover exhaust heat on a motorbike with a steam bottoming cycle? We'll run the exhaust in a heat exchanger and then oh dear. Mhm.
Well, I think one way that we have tried to do things like that is the fabled rear radiator, running the air through the motorcycle and into a radiator that's exhausting its heat into the
Because a radiator is potentially a jet engine of low grade.
and
Yes.
that and you see the exhaust pipes on on MotoGP bikes. Some, not all of them, but many of them have it right at the end of the tail section,
Yep.
exhausting straight into the lower pressure area, and maybe we would get a notional increase.
Well, in World War II, um, the fighter planes with V12 engines had rear directed exhaust stubs on each cylinder. And I learned that they got about 400 horsepower worth of jet thrust.
Get out. Wow.
Good one, huh?
Yeah.
And so for bomber engines and for cargo planes, which need to sit up at high altitude where the air doesn't hold you back much, they're going to need a compressor to restore sea level density to the cylinder filling. Turbochargers,
Turbo normalizing.
B-17s. Yes, B-17s, all turbocharged, B-24s, B-29, up there at high altitude with those turbos humming away, compressing air to make the engines more powerful, even though the altitude loss of density is considerable at 30,000 feet. So there are all kinds of ways that we could get more from the fuel that we put into our motorcycles, but they are complicated. They are expensive. They don't work except at constant power level. So what about turbocharging motorcycles? Works very well for drag racing and for record setting. But I remember seeing a race at Mid-Ohio. The man on the microphone was going nuts about these turbo bikes that were just going to set things on fire. So the race started. The turbine bikes, they disappeared into turn one. And after the tumult, there was quiet. And then here came the field. No turbo bikes. A few seconds later, here they came, being very careful at each corner. Turbochargers, as simple turbochargers that do not have electronic control of boost, have terrible steep torque curves like those of two strokes and tend to throw the rider off.
Yeah, Formula USA gave a very open, this is sort of circa 95, 2000, somewhere in that range. They had a very open rule plan, and you could bring your turbo, you could run nitrous. Nitrous was kind of a neat solution because you could apply it as required. You could have your, corner exit and then get up on the fat part of the tire and then hit the button and get your extra boost. But turbo bikes, as Kevin points out, the more I don't know, it's, what do you say? The faster you go, the faster you go. And boy, you'd screw it on and there'd be lag. There were all kinds of schemes in cars where they have turbos that had variable vanes, and they were trying to control the momentum of the impeller so that you had a more constant boost.
It's just putting your thumb over the end of the garden hose. Yeah. That's what it is.
And trying to keep the pressure more constant so that what you're getting, what does a rider want? A rider wants a torque rheostat.
Yep.
Absolutely predictable amount of torque for how much I'm turning it. And if I'm rolling it on and I'm going up and I'm on the throttle stop, or anywhere before that, I don't want a massive increase in torque for every 100 RPM.
Yes.
Because what happens? That's a high side.
Yeah. How are you going to control it? Well, the thing that looks really promising here is Honda's electric supercharger, because it has a very powerful electric motor on it, so that from the instruction go until useful boost, or until the boost that the rider wants, is very quick. That looks like a workable system.
It does, but we still have to pay for it.
Oh yeah, yeah.
because you got to generate you on that motorcycle. You have to generate the electricity. I put an electric power steering pump on my Jaguar Mark II, my 1966 Jaguar, because I wanted to put the air conditioning compressor where the generator was and move the power steering pump away from this stuff, because I put an alternator up high where you could see it and the AC compressor where the generator used to be. So I have power and now I have air conditioning, but how do I get power steering? I found a power steering pump from a Toyota that's electric. It's about this big, as big as a bottle of gin.
Yeah.
Has a reservoir on top, electric pump on bottom. Its maximum draw is 50 amps. That's why I need an alternator now. And you need big fat cables. And when that thing goes, you can see, you watch the lights dim. You know what I mean? Like it's,
Yep.
if you're really sawing it in a parking lot. So to turn this compressor on this Honda, the V3 Honda concept that they're now teasing with moving videos.
Oh, it's going to take horsepower. Yeah.
Yeah. So you got it. Your alternator is going to go, huh, and just really bear down and drive those amps into probably a bigger battery, or let's say a higher capacity battery, probably lithium in this case, just to keep the weight down.
Now we're going to say, well, all the more reason to go electric right now. Let's go to the dealer. Forget all this internal combustion. Let's go electric.
It is a pain in the ass, I have to admit, internal combustion.
Yeah. Because let's face it, all the electronic trickery, the anti-spin, the anti-wheelie, the launch control, all of that is working to turn the output of an internal combustion engine into an electric motor output. Controllable, smooth, predictable. Internal combustion makes me think of a battleship with 16-inch guns firing them all at once. Patooey! It's a wild release of energy in pulses. The internal combustion engine is driven by pulses. How do you deal with that? Well, we've done okay. We've done okay. But why not electric motor? So we're thinking, well, they accelerate well. They're hell on tires and brakes because of the weight. When I looked at the first electric racer that Dorna was running in their electric race, it was an Energica. I don't think they're trading any longer.
No.
Energica at 589 pounds. Now, the riders in MotoGP are complaining now that 357 pounds, which is the weight, the minimum, is really a lot of weight for a racing motorcycle.
Well, the 500 Grand Prix bikes were 286 pounds.
That was after the rule that required them to be 130 kilograms. Yes, before that, they were like 250 something.
I've only been on a 250 Grand Prix bike one time, but my goodness, what a thing it was. You totally understood the difference between race bikes and street bikes at that point. I did. Because I was, I mean, I'm a street product tester who likes to race occasionally, right? Like, so I'm always riding something that's too heavy and doesn't make enough power, and it's the soft seat. You know, on a 250 GP bike, and it was just all information, and it was just as light as could be. And by the way, I'm not 286 pounds, but I've been 200 pounds, or more for a long time. So I'm like 50% of the weight of a 250 Grand Prix bike. That's why I don't race them.
Yeah.
So
people talk constantly about batteries are improving by leaps and bounds, but in fact, they improve slowly. The next horizon that is expected is the solid electrolyte battery, which is supposed to be a lot safer, can be lighter, but it's incrementally better. It is not going to cut battery mass in half or by 9/10. So right now, what's happening with electric bikes, whether you love them or are indifferent to them, what's happening is that they are being offered to the market as an experiment. And we watch how well they do in the market. Now, here's one that really kills me. We're sailing along the straightaway, and there's a turn up ahead. We get on the brakes, and all that beautiful kinetic energy that we had, that the engine worked so hard to stuff into the motorcycle, 1/2 mv squared, m is mass, v is velocity, is now going to be turned into waste heat, which will trail behind us as hot little vortices streaming off of the brake discs, which are up at 800 centigrade, 900. And the brakes of today are wonderful. They aren't sudden like trying very hard big drum brakes were. You touch them and they tended to go right to maximum, those big ones. Disc brakes are smooth and progressive. They're such an improvement over the past, and many refinements have occurred. So I think brakes are one of the great accomplishments, but they're wasteful. So while you're lying awake at 4 a.m., your head full of useless thoughts, think about what can we put on the front wheel that will allow us to get that energy back in a reusable form. Now, I let my fingers do the walking this morning, and I found that an English company called YASA, I don't know what that's about, has made a motor, electric motor, axial flux, that generates 500 foot-pounds of torque from a 29-pound unit. Now, what that suggests to me is 500 foot-pounds at the front wheel is not maximum braking, but it's getting there, pretty close. The braking systems we have weigh 15 to 20 pounds. So it could be that in the next few years, an electric energy recovery system in the front wheel, not connected to the engine through the rear wheel where very little braking occurs, in the front wheel, possibly integrated into its structure, could convert that 1/2 mv squared into something stored in an ultra capacitor or a you name it, and which could then be unleashed as we emerged from the corner and reaccelerated. And the engine could just sit there going, dum, 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 let me know when you want me. Because we're reusing the energy that would have gone into the brake. Again, no hardware exists for this. Do we want to lug a 250-pound battery? Could that battery accept that much power for 3, 4, 5 seconds? How thick would the cables be?
I was just going to say, you get a 100 amp alternator on your vehicle, and the wire is pretty heavy gauge. And then I was looking at a fire unit, which is a diesel water tender that we use at our fire department. And I was just having to look at all the components. We have a kid in the engineering academy who's learning. He knows nothing about cars, and I was like, "Oh, let's go over the components," because he was talking about, I'm checking the shocks for leaks, and I'm doing this, and he's doing the safety inspection, and he doesn't actually know what a shock is. He's just under there saying that. I'm like, let's actually talk about what these parts do. And I looked at the alternator on this thing, and it's a fire unit. It's designed to idle forever, and it needs lots of power because there's pumps and things going on. And man, the alternator cable was like this. It was huge, great big thing, probably making 300 amps.
Big copper bars, 3 of them, coming from the front wheel.
Yeah,
to some device which doesn't exist yet. So that's why we don't have energy recovery. And the electric motorcycles that do have energy recovery, it is recovered only through the rear wheel because it drives through the electric motor that's driving the motorcycle.
Again, that it goes to the packaging of the automobile, where if you put electric motors on each wheel or one in the front with a drive distribution to the wheels, you can recover you can have 4-wheel electric
You could, yeah. Yep.
regenerative braking, but we like motorcycles a lot more, and we would like to find solutions there.
Yeah.
So heat, we're talking about heat, and I want to go now, if we can move away from brakes, that heat is power. If the heat that's being generated is not being ultimately concentrated within the combustion chamber and pushing down on the piston, it is waste.
Yep.
If the engine is generating heat in other ways, that is horsepower, watts being
The practical engine is a container for burning fuel, air, vapor, and being exposed to it for a few degrees out of every 720 is a great benefit to us, because it gives all that time during which the heat picked up by the cylinder head, the piston crown, the valve heads can sort of, oh, here's the exit here, I'll go out. But that's waste heat. And we know it's waste heat because when Keith Duckworth designed the DFV Formula One engine, he designed it to burn really fast, so that at peak torque, it needed 27 degrees of ignition timing.
Go, Keith.
That means less time exposure of metal to hot gas. They were able to leave in their dust the V12 Matra, which had piston domes that stuck up as if they were mountains trying to stop the wind of turbulence that speeds combustion.
I will give them credit for making one of the greatest sounding engines ever.
Oh, no
even
question. Sure.
Even if it didn't make the most power.
This is wonderful, because when you're a little child running around making motor noises, oh, isn't he cute?
No.
We were very serious about these noises.
Yeah.
And we were also very discriminating. We knew what we liked. And was not it. The high, sweet song.
Oh, I could get along with a hit or miss engine now.
Well, they're an interesting variety, because, for example, they had reciprocating magnetos. Nothing in the magneto spun. Great. And it can work perfectly well. How does a linear motor work that powers those maglev trains? Anyway, the Army decided that it was going to do something about this, and they decided they were going to build an uncooled engine, diesel, because it won't work for spark ignition, because if you let the insides of the combustion chamber become very hot, the air is heated as it enters, and it says, oh, goody, we're going to detonate this time. And it does. But in a diesel, okay. So they made the piston, they coated the piston crown with zinc oxide, and they made everything out of Inconel something or other, so that they were able to build an essentially uncooled engine. And the goal was super efficiency, so that there won't have to be so many millions of drums of diesel dragged into a battle zone. Well, the hotter the inside of the combustion chamber operated, the harder it was to persuade air to go in, because the moment that it touched that hot metal, it expanded. And if you were trying to push it in with the turbocharger, it was getting to be a pretty equal contest. Well, I'm not going in there. No matter what you say, I'm not going in there. It's hot in there. And
Massive
the turbocharger pushing us all in. And in the end, they decided that they were losing as much power trying to cram pure air, that's what a diesel takes in, the fuel is injected later, to cram pure air into a hot box than they were gaining from cutting the heat loss from
into
the
the
combustion
metal
gas.
parts.
Yeah. So this is another compromise. It's sort of like, well, my wife and I haven't spoken for 20 years, but we know how to get along here. You read novels like this about people that have worked out a way to live that works for them. And it seems really strange. Well, the compromises with human designed devices, they're so filled with compromises that oftentimes people who hear about how they work for the first time are you kidding? All that heat loss? That's crazy. The only way that can work is in a world with infinite energy, and we don't have that. Well, let's get political, shall we? No, we shall not. So we're thinking of, we want very, very lightweight pistons so that their inertia does not create large bearing loads, does not require thicker connecting rods, etc. But we're spraying oil at the piston to keep it cool. That oil is picking up that heat and it's going to the oil cooler. That again is sort of like anything you don't want in your apartment, just throw it out the window. Waste heat from everything.
Windage.
And electrics are no better, because if you turn a Tesla upside down and label all the stuff, you find that coolant is being circulated in such ways that they're trying to keep some things warm and some things cool, and there are little valves and sensors and so forth. To keep their compromises on an even keel, they need intelligence. And that's why our world is run by the equivalent of ECUs. Something that takes in the data from all the sensors and says, oh, I can kind of smooth this out and make it work. It's marvelous that engines now have mapped ignitions. When I had my TD1, which was made in 1965, like all two-strokes, it had split personality. At lower RPM, where the exhaust pipe was not furiously pumping air, it needed 36 degrees of ignition timing, like a four-stroke. The air in the cylinder, the charge in the cylinder was not pure enough to propagate flame any faster than that. But then when we got to a higher RPM and the pipe began to it's humming along with the tune, and then it opens its mouth and begins to sing loudly, it's pumping a lot of air. Suddenly, the best ignition timing is 15 degrees before top dead center, because all those fuel and air molecules in the combustion chamber are so close together, they develop a hot relationship very quickly. So the flame spread is rapid, less ignition timing needed. Well, what did we do? We set a compromised timing. It made the engine overheat on top and made it weak on the bottom. Good one. So modern engines have an electronic map stored in the ECU, which has the correct ignition timing for every throttle opening, every RPM. It's stored there. Information was discovered on the dyno and recorded. So always the ignition timing is correct. The same is done for the fuel. This is a wonderful piece of progress, because a carburetor was sort of like the fixative sprayer that artists used to spray fixative onto a pastel so that it didn't all blow away if somebody sneezed. It's got a tube that goes down into a bottle of this stuff, and another tube blows across the top of it. It pulled droplets up out of the supply tube and broke them up into a mist. That's what a carburetor was, and it ran rich in the summer and lean in the winter. But then the EPA arrived and said, mustn't. Today we have wonderful digital fuel injection that allows the EPA and other such regulatory bodies to feel that they're doing their job. And we, on the other hand, have excellent performance from engines that are equipped with this technology. So that's a really good one. That's a score for us.
It is. I messed around. I always mess around with carburetors carburetors on my XS 650, my Norton Commando, Take a Drink Velicette.
It's a priesthood. It's fascinating. Once
It's
you're
fascinating,
in, you're
fun.
always in.
And,
Yeah.
when the first time I looked inside of a Triumph TR6 car engine, I took off the air filter and I was like, huh. And I got on the linkage and I was looking inside and I revved the engine and I was like, holy moly, like watching the fuel just whisk out in this white mist from the main jet. I was like, wow, these are Stromberg carburetors.
Yeah.
They're a CB carburetor, just like you'd find on a lot of motorcycles, with a rubber diaphragm and one orifice for fuel to be delivered, the center jet. And
Yep.
then the piston moves up and down through air running through the carburetor, making a vacuum in a chamber that's sealed by that rubber diaphragm. And yeah, it was remarkable. Then, we're into the world of modern technology, and I had a 1958 MG Magnet, which is a 4-door saloon, very proper British looking thing. And it had a 1500 cc inline 4 like they use in the MGA. And it had twin carburetors, 1.5 or 1.25 twin SUs, variable height jet. So I rebuilt those to the nth degree, and I got the jets perfectly centered because it's all mechanical on those. You have to loosen the nut and center the jet so it doesn't rub on the needle. I did all of that, and then I put a header on it, and it ran a lot better, but the fueling was off. And so I started messing with the fueling, and I said, I'm doing this all by plugs and feel. And I finally said, you know what? AIM Electronics, there's a, it's mostly car stuff. It all works on bikes, not all, but it works on bikes too. But AIM had a black box that you hook up to an O2 sensor. So I ground a hole in my exhaust pipe, welded a bung on, and I put a wideband O2 sensor, and I started reading the O2 of my SU carburetors, and it made me insane because it was everywhere. It was full throttle. It would go, certain settings, it would go down to 10, and then it would be 12, and it'd be 11. And then, but you have one needle in an SU that determines the mixture over the entire range. And the range is determined by the engine speed, which lifts or lowers the piston based on the velocity of air going through. So
with
that
the needle
is
hanging from it.
with
Yep.
the needle hanging from it. And so then you're faced with, do I make custom needles to do all this? And we don't have to mess with that anymore. We have a fuel injector that is 24 pounds per hour, or whatever you need, at its maximum duty cycle, which is it's open all the time and it's just hosing fuel in there. That's 100%. And then everything below that, it's just a pulse. It's the length of the pulse that opens. It lets the fuel pressure go bzz. And at idle, it's like, well, and you could hear them clicking. You could stick your screwdriver and they go.
Yep.
And that's the pulse. So you're running 33 pounds or 50 pounds, and it can talk to the O2 sensor. That's what they closed loop. They go, the O2 sensor says, nope, that little more, nope, little less, little more, little less. And it does it a bazillion times a second. And I just turn the key and drive away. Now, I love carburetors and I'm always going to play with them, but you have to appreciate on your Toyota when you get in, and
what has been done.
It has that getting there feeling, so
another area where I think we've done well is the driveline. Gears are highly efficient. Primary gear from the crankshaft to the gearbox input shaft, and then in the gearbox are 4 or 5 or 6 gear pairs, 2 shafts parallel to each other. And so if we reckon that these gears aren't exceptionally efficient, say 2% in the primary gear, 2% in the gearbox, and 2% in the chain. Well, now somebody's going to raise his or her hand and say, well, we beg to differ because we put these things on the roller dyno and we're seeing a 15% loss from the engine to the roller. To which I would say, and yes, and I've talked to people that run those dynos who've been hit in the back and made black and blue by tread separations because they have to strap a powerful machine down against that roller so hard that it is putting a standing wave in the tire that generates heat like nothing else. Heat is power. Heat is 15%.
Yeah,
So
the more powerful stuff you do, but it's a thing we do on our dyno where you set the same tire pressure, because if you had a 50 psi or a 30 psi, you're going to get an inconsistent number from bike to bike. So we've picked a number, and every tire gets that pressure. Lubricating the chain, clean lubricated chain, couple percent, 1-2% easily.
Mhm.
If you get a dry, even an O-ring chain that's purportedly lubricated internally for life, or for death, as they say. Just a low viscosity coating on the outside of the chain, you pick up a couple horsepower on a 100 horsepower bike, let's say. You can. And on lower horsepower bikes, we don't just strap the thing down, because you're not really worried about it spinning the tire. But I have done turbo Hayabusas and stuff where you're using tie down straps to hold the bike back, because it wants to go forward so hard. Even though you're
Yeah.
in the front chalk, you're exerting so much force that you need to sort of distribute it everywhere. And that is not a tire. If you use that tire to run that horsepower, 400 horse or 300 horse, something like that, you don't want to use that tire to ride around on, as Kevin's pointing out.
So I think that's why there's this estimate that says 15% loss between the engine and the roller.
I can't say that I've ever measured that, but what we see consistently over decades of dynoing bikes is the manufacturers say it makes X, and we see X minus 10, X minus 12, X minus 15%.
Yep. There's, of course, there's rolling loss on the highway, tire loss, and that's why all this talk about sticky tires cost you top end. That used to be the case when the British industry in about 1958 came out with road hug or cling rubber. What this was high hysteresis styrene butadiene rubber, SBR, rather than natural rubber. And this kind of rubber compound had a lot of internal friction. Internal friction in the tread surface generates wonderful wet and dry grip, but it also loses a few miles per hour on top, because the rubber of which the tire is made, you flex it and let it unflex, and you don't get back 100% of what you put in. You get back 80% or even less. The rest becomes that wonderful open window in the apartment, heat, dump it out. It's gone. Waste heat. So if you were to work out how much fuel your motorcycle would need if everything operated at unimaginable 100% efficiency, would be practically nothing. So all this extra fuel is used to cover the compromises. And don't imagine that the electric world that we are told is coming, check the sales, is going to establish perfection now and forever, because where does electricity come from? It comes from a variety of systems. One day it may all come from renewables, but only some comes from them now. So, compromises stand in the way, arms folded, wherever you go. This far and no farther, buddy.
Yeah.
So the motorcycle is a mixture, and you could do the same thing for aircraft or ships or computers. Look at the giant data centers that they're building and AI support centers. They're having to buy their own power stations to run these things. Think of the heat, because that's where it's going. The electricity goes in to run the billions of tiny switches, and as those electrons make their way through the crystal lattice, excuse me, can I get through here, please? Yes. when they get home, they're going to need more than 2 beers to calm down. Those electrons are generating heat. They go rattling through the crystal lattice. Crystal lattice gets warmer. The little molecules are vibrating more.
Yeah, that's where the hairdryer noises come from on your laptop.
Yep. Hairdryer noises. Yes.
You make it think too much.
So we're another. Back to the driveline. I think DCT is a genuine step forward. Having a dual clutch transmission allows you to make highly efficient shifts. It can be automated, or you can operate it yourself. What could be better? Similar with automated clutch and throttle systems on some other bikes. Good stuff. And I used to imagine when I was riding my vibrating TD1 and did it vibrate, I imagined a motorcycle that would be smooth, and that when I turned the throttle this way, it would accelerate, and when I turned the throttle this way, it would brake. And I thought, wouldn't that be nice? But I forgot all about that for 40 years because of the compromises that we have to wrestle with. So we like riding them.
I want to hop back in the engine because one thing that we didn't talk about was windage. We talked about it. It came to mind because spraying oil on the bottom of the pistons is a very common way of cooling the pistons so they don't melt in the middle where they're the hottest. And so they put jets, and there could be one per piston. There could be multiples, and they're spraying free oil into the void of the crankcase that's typically suffering massive pressure variation and is full of flinging parts.
Yep.
The pistons are going up and down, and we're spraying oil at it. And what happens? That also, it's taking heat out of the piston, but it's also generating heat in the oil. It's putting that heat into the oil.
Accelerated. The oil is being.
And then everything that the oil hits, every time it's churning through a gear and doing all that business, it's making heat. And it's a kind of heat that just keeps going and going. You just can't get rid of it if it's a bad situation. You look at, I've been recently looking at the FTR 750 engine. I think, well, that's a really pretty smart design. It has a very long, low, narrow sump with fins on it. It's a long way from the crankshaft center. It's a wet sump engine, but it's a long way. Wet sump means the oil is stored in the cavity of the engine. Dry sump is you have a pump that scavenges it out and puts it into a separate tank, so that you don't have, hopefully, any free oil pooling about in the bottom of your engine. But the FTR separates that oil volume far from the spinning crankshaft, and inside the cases, it has essentially a scraper. It's very tightly surrounded by internal castings that keep the oil from ricocheting off the crankshaft. So it takes the oil and gets rid of it and gets it back to the sump ASAP without being beaten on by all the parts and generating heat. Yep. And it's a big deal. Like if you don't have a sump, it's something that's been brought to my attention. XG 750, the Harley 750 twin that they're racing and have raced. Vance and Hines, does a lot of work with those.
Dirt tracking.
The sump on the factory bike is right here. Like it's right where all the spinny bits are. And the race bikes do have a sump hanging down, but I think big sumps, drag race engines. What do? 30 inches of vacuum. They got 4 motors pulling vacuum on the crankcase.
They're electric.
Electric motors.
Yeah. sucking
it out. A very good.
So there's nothing in the way of the moving parts.
It can be done sort of it is sort of passive. It's using the energy of the crankcase pressure variation through a check valve, crankcase breather valve. Ducatis have a pretty good one. There was one that was made by this guy, Jim Comstock for Norton Commandos, where you put a reed breather in the bottom of the engine crankcase, and the variations in a Norton are quite high because both pistons, if it's 828 cc's of displacement in the cylinder, when you're pulling in, well, guess what's happening below that? You're displacing 828 cc's of crankcase.
Yeah.
And so suddenly it goes, whoa! And then the piston's back goes, whoa!
Yep.
And somewhere in there, if you can put a check valve when that pressure
It'll
goes
pump
high,
itself down.
it pumps itself down, the pistons go back up, that reed closes, and you get a lower pressure.
And all
Drag
those
race,
old-time singles had such a system to pump the crankcase down.
not so much on the Velocette, I'm going to say.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, a lot of them had time breathers. But
yeah.
this brings me to what Dick O'Brien told me. And this would be early 70s. He said when our V-twin race engine, the flathead this was, would wet sump, which means failure to scavenge oil out of the crankcase, allowing the crankshaft to whirl that oil around and to wallow and bathe in it while trying to spin. He said you could see it happen. They'd come off the end of the banking, and he said it was like a big hand came down, just slowed that bike right up, because he said the minute the wet sumping started, so much power was being consumed by that it was visible. You could see it.
XS650, Yamaha XS650 in stock form. People like to race those. It's a very popular vintage race engine. And if you look at the guys who are going fast, they have a sump on the bottom and add additional sump. So there's a plate that holds the filter screen. They put a big drop sump on it that's containing a large volume oil, allowing we continue with our 2,500 or 3,000 cc's of total oil volume that's lubricating the engine and doing its job, but we move it down into a fin sump where it can A, get cooler and not store the heat, and B, it keeps it out of the spinning bits. Because in an XS650, I think the CB350 is the same way, where the oil level is actually touching the crank. And it's just a massive heat generating, and every watt of that heat that you're putting in the oil is not driving the bike forward. So
Yes.
if you have a race engine that's making 400 degrees of oil temperature,
something bad going on.
And at the same time, you're thinking, I need more power for the mile. I need more power at the end of the front straight. And my oil temperature is 500 degrees or 400 degrees. Anything above what do you think a race motor should be, Kevin? 220? 180.
Yeah, somewhere's in there. That's what the oil companies want.
The street guys, like a street engine, we have positive crankcase ventilation, which helps, but they always talk about making vapor out of any water that might be in the crankcases. So they want it over boiling sometimes, so over 212 on a street motor. But yeah, you don't care about that on a race engine, because we're gonna take it apart every 20 minutes anyway.
Because water is a product of combustion.
Yeah.
And when you're warming up an engine, the cylinder walls are cold. They condense that water, and the piston rings may pump some down into the crankcase where it mixes with the oil. Bad. Don't want. One of the things that was done to deal with crankshaft windage in quite early days, was that instead of having a 4-cylinder crank or a 3-cylinder crank enclosed by 2 crankcase halves that fitted tightly around the crankshaft, they had only an upper crankcase half. And the crankshaft main bearings were made like pillow blocks. They had 2 bolt holes through them, and the crankshaft was bolted to the underside of the cylinder. So there was nothing near. There was no enclosing crankcase. That was all standing back, allowing the oil being thrown off to run down the sides, where it was no longer close enough to the crank to be accelerated by the windage.
Well, there's, the hot rod guys, windage tray, they would make a thing that was very like a plate that typically went in between the oil pan and the bottom of the engine block, which would have pillow blocks like you're talking about, bolt-on mains. And they would put a plate that kind of followed the slots and everything in the crank and allowed the engine to spin, but it was to hopefully capture flinging oil and keep it away from the crank so that it wasn't getting churned around and around. You mentioned the other day OX5, the aircraft engine, having screens in the interior of the crankcase that were standing off, whatever fit, a half inch, an inch, something that would capture that flying oil and keep it from going back.
Perforated metal.
perforated metal and allowed it to go on the crankcase side and drain rapidly back
to the scavenge pump.
To the scavenge pump.
And
that's why a lot of race cars, there have been plenty of examples of engines that have been wet sump engines that convert. They've been dry sumped, and they make an adaptation of the engine so that you have a separate oil tank and a pump furiously pumping out the oil and maybe reducing the crankcase pressure and letting the oil go back to a tank that maybe has big fins or some cooling ability, and then pumping fresh oil back into the pressure pump.
It has been known that some manufacturers, some constructors of racing engines have made tiltable dynos so that they can simulate the acceleration of the vehicle and see where the oil goes. So the thing is sitting there on the dyno cranking out hundreds of horsepower, and they tip the thing up and watch all the oil pressures. Because
there was that period when I first noticed on Ducatis, they switched to this great big dagger style sump. So it kind of all coned down, and that wasn't necessarily a windage thing. It was a let's not run out of oil for the suction.
We don't want the pump pushing air
hard,
into the
hard acceleration, or let's do a wheelie for a quarter mile. And I understand from some internal lore that when the Softail was being tested, the new Softail that replaced the Dyna, that they made the single cruiser line and got rid of the Dyna in the lineup. There were the Dyna folks who were the high performance guys, the stunt dudes, and always doing the wheelies. Like you don't see too many fat boys out there doing, big smoky burnouts and huge wheelies. And so they apparently tested with some of the Dyna guys and kind of let them have at it with the Softail to make sure it wouldn't run out of oil while they were wheeling. Pretty cool stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, the internal life of the engine or the transmission. I look back at all my time working on things, and I had a Triumph TR6 car, my first car, and I was doing some transmission work. And I thought, you know what? Before I put the cover on, I'd like to see this thing run with the top cover off and see what happens. And it was great. You can take off the tunnel in a Triumph TR6. The factory was this sad piece of cardboard that always got oil soaked and destroyed. I fiberglassed mine and helped it out and improved the seal. And I felt less lightheaded while I was driving, which was great. And I took the cover off because that's how you get the trans out. You can take it out through the interior, take out the seats. So you can see the whole thing. Bolted it in, ready to go. It's hooked up to the rear wheels. It's on 4 jack stands. And I'm like, I'm going to wrap this sucker with plastic wrap. And I'm going to put it in gear. And I'm going to run it and see what happens. I'm like, I'll put it in 4th gear because that'll make things spin around, like the output's going to be high. And so I clicked the selector by hand because the forks were off because the top has the forks. And I moved the selector to 4th. I think this was 4th gear. And I let the clutch out. And I was like, oh, wow. It was very vigorous, even at low RPM. And then I went run in 4th gear, and I revved it up to like 2,500 or 3,000, which would be 60 miles per hour. And I could not believe the agitation of the oil inside the gearbox. I'm like, well, that's why this thing doesn't have an oil pump. Some gearboxes do have oil pumps. And efficiently now, we're not letting splash lubrication take care of a lot of different gear trains. We're putting drips, sprays of oil into the gear train that's just enough to do the job and
an
not
engineer named Hata joined Yamaha in like 61. And he brought that idea into service, that there would be an oil gallery with little drillings, one oil jet for each gear pair.
Nice.
No more gears dipping into oil. They don't dip, they whip. As Mark just noted, when the engine is running, the inside of the gearbox is a violent oil storm. This is the last thing you want for efficiency, is tons of oil going through the mesh, because it's having to be pumped out of there at tremendous speed, squeezed out from those shapes that are coming
Yeah.
together on oil. So that's why it is better to have an individual, quite small jet for each mesh. And you'll find that on all race engines now.
Yeah, there's also the spray bar on some camshafts. I think that's mostly a American V8 thing, or actually I think a lot of the older the guys running the 4-cylinder, cross flow Cortinas and stuff like that, or overhead cam, they put a little spray bar that drips oil on the lobe itself to make sure that we are adequately covered.
Well, in the Honda CBR that we made those videos with, the cams are hollow and they're full of oil, and each lobe has an oil jet drilled in the lobe, so that as the thing is starting to begin the lift process, first it lubricates, then it lifts the valve. Good one.
I could talk about the inside of an engine forever, Kevin.
That's what we've done. That's just what we've done.
Yep.
So, stuff to think about.
Yeah. But imagine if we got everything perfect, how fast and efficient we might be.
Holy Toledo. Yeah.
350 miles an hour on the freeway going to work, getting 1,000,000 miles per gallon.
We don't have the tires. We don't have the chain. We don't have the stability, but we can conceive of it.
Yep. Well, we keep striving. That's what it is. You just got to keep striving. You got to keep learning. And as you always say, be your own expert. Just keep thinking about it. Yeah. What else are you going to do at 4:00? Worry about the future? Nah.
And if you don't know anything, you don't have anything to think about.
Yeah. Oh, gracious.
Can't have that.
Yeah. Well, thanks for listening, folks. That's it for now. We'll catch you next time. See you in the comments. Tell us what to talk about. And we'll try to talk about it. We'll see what's up. We'll thank Octane Lending for its ongoing support of our brands. We appreciate it very much. Click the link in the description. You can go get potentially pre-qualified for the bike of your dreams. Just go check it out. You can shop there, shop on cycleworld.com, etc. Find your bike, and maybe we can help you out. Thanks for listening.